Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Tyler Wynn. You may not recognize me because I'm wearing a tie. I've been told 3 times this morning that I'm wearing Royals colors. So I decided that's the reason I'm wearing it. Actually, obviously, I dressed up a little nicer for Steve Black's memorial this afternoon, which all are invited to at 2 o'clock. We appreciate your support. So, we have gotten through, I believe, 7 chapters of the story. We've gone through the patriarchs. We've gone through the Exodus out of Egypt. We've gone through the giving of the law, the wandering in the desert. And now we have finished what they call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And we're ready to move on to another section today, to the book of Joshua. And because we're in Joshua, we get to discuss some interesting stories. There is the conquest of Jericho. There's the prostitute Rahab who helps the 2 spies. And of course, they march around the city and the walls come tumbling down. My wife has been singing that song all week. I'm getting it in my head now. I'm trying to get rid of it. Here we have all of these stories. But one of the things that when I read the book of Joshua and also into the book of Judges is I realize that there's a great deal of, let's just say, violence in these books. These are war books. This is where people are fighting over land. And it seems God-sanctioned holy wars. And I read about this, and it puzzles me. I don't know what to think about that. Because, as you do, I also live in a world that's full of terrorism. People who, in the name of God, commit terrible acts of violence that frighten us. And this is unacceptable to the world. It's unacceptable to me. So we would live in a world so violent that every day on the news we hear about a murder somewhere. A world where violence happens, and all too often people have justified it in the name of God. And when I look at these books and I hear about this violence, I feel obligated to say something about it, why it's there, and what we as Christians can do to think about it. Because you see, there are a lot of people out there who have talked about these books and the violence therein, and have criticized faith and Christianity in particular. I was reading this week about Richard Dawkins and his the things that he says about violence in the Bible. It occurred to me that I could not let that pass today without saying something. So what do we do with the God who's a warrior? So the first thing I think of when someone asks those questions, I have to answer them. Is sometimes the best way to answer a question is to come back with a story. Jesus did it all the time. It was a story that told the point of what people were asking about. And I thought through my years in school for a story or something that would help me understand these books a little bit better. And you know what I went back to? One of my favorite books of all time, To Kill a Mockingbird. Many of you probably read it in school at some point by Harper Lee. It's a very famous book, very beloved. It's about a girl named Scout who narrates it. And she goes through this time where her father is a lawyer and he's taken on the case of defending a black man accused of rape in 1930s in the Deep South. And we get the story of Scout growing up in the neighborhood and her father defending this man and everything that happens around it. And it's a great book. There's a great movie about it. But I always remember this one particular chapter that stands out in my mind. there's a chapter in which Atticus, her father, actually let me back up, Scout, who's narrating it, the little girl, is bemoaning, lamenting the fact that her father is so old and decrepit and boring. These are the things my kids are going to complain about one day. But she's complaining that her dad is so old and boring. He doesn't play on the yearly homecoming football game that all the other dads do. And he doesn't really like to hunt or fish or do anything outdoors. He doesn't coach the sports teams. He's really boring compared to all the other dads she could have. All he does really is sit around and read. And this bothers her. And she's worried about it. So here she is, sort of lamenting this fact in the book, sort of narrating it. And then something happens in this chapter that sort of changes her perspective. You see, one day Scout and her brother Jim are out playing in their neighborhood along the street that goes by their house. And they look off into the distance and see something strange. And it's a dog. And this dog is walking toward them, but it's kind of funny looking because the dog doesn't seem to have his feet under him. He's sort of drifting side to side and wobbling and stumbling. More than that, he gets a little closer and there's foam coming out of his mouth. They realize there's something not right about this dog. So Scout runs to the lady who takes care of them called Calpurnia, and she tells some people that sooner or later the news gets out around town that there is a rabid dog in the neighborhood. That everyone needs to stay indoors until they take care of it. So they make some phone calls and eventually the police arrive. And so the policeman pulls in, and who is riding in the car with him? Her father, Atticus. And they both step out of the car. And they decide they will do what they have to do. And the policeman, he grabs his gun, I think he has a rifle, and he holds it up to his eye, and he points, and he's trying to do it, but he's shaky, and he's nervous, and he's shaking his head. He says, "No, I can't do it. Here, Atticus, you do it." And Atticus complains for a while, says, no, I can't do it. No, I haven't shot a gun in a long time. No, you do it. And they sort of go back and forth arguing about who's going to do it. And finally, Atticus gives in. And he grabs the gun, and he stands in place, and he points it, and something's not right. So he brings it down, he pulls off his glasses. This man who once stood before a mob with nothing but a newspaper, who does nothing but read all the time, pulls his glasses off, drops them to the ground, and they crunch into pieces. He puts the gun back up to his eye, now clear to see. And all of a sudden, it's as if his whole body relaxes. As if the gun were an extension of his body. As if he'd been doing this all his life. He relaxes, he takes a deep breath, and the shot goes right between his eyes. The dog's eyes. Just to be clear. Sorry. After that, Scout is rather amazed at the events that just happened. And the police officer who was there begins to tell her about how great a shot her dad was growing up. About what an amazing rifleman he was. How he used to travel the county and shoot better than anyone around. He had a reputation before him. And Scout, who thought her dad was old and decrepit and boring, finds out it's a little more interesting than she thought. Now, why do I tell that story? That was kind of long. But I tell that story because when I imagine our God, I imagine Him as being kind and gentle. And I read about Him in the New Testament. I see a God who tells us to love and forgive and have mercy and be kind and gracious to one another. But yet I find that this is a God who is capable when the moment happens to step up and be a warrior and fight on behalf of his people. The God who's generally kind and soft-spoken, but in the moment when the neighborhood is in danger, when it really matters, God has the power to protect his people. He is an example of kindness and gentleness wrapped up with the ability to take care of business when it needs to happen. This is our God, capable of both things, capable of being kind and gentle, but taking care of the rabid dog when he needs to. God fights on behalf of his people. And that's something that the Bible can teach us in the books of Joshua and Judges. So, as we go through the book of Joshua, I want to give you just a few ideas of how to think about these books. Just a few ideas will help us understand why such violence could occur in the Bible. It is my belief that above all else, what we have to keep in mind is the upper story. Remember, throughout the story, we've been drawing a distinction between the lower story and the things that are happening on the human level. And we're keeping in mind the higher story, the upper story, God's plan, and what he has in mind to happen. And we can see this plan unfolding before us. God, who lost human beings in the fall, is trying to get them back. So he started from scratch with a man named Abraham. They took Abraham and reached out to his son, Isaac, then to his son, Jacob, then to Jacob's 12 sons, and eventually he built a people group who lived in Egypt. Then he pulled them out of Egypt, and he's bringing them to the promised land. And one day, through those people, he's going to reveal himself to the world. And through that, he's going to bring the law. And through that, he's going to birth a Messiah. But God promised on oath to bring these people into the promised land. And the problem is that when they get there, there's already people there. And yet I tell you that God's plan must prevail. You see, every step afterwards depends on the step that they get the land God promised. And so there's a sense in which God's will, his plan, is higher than any other rule. That what God plans must happen because the plan is unfolding, the story is unfolding, and one day they're going to need that land, and they're going to birth a Messiah, and they're going to save all human beings. But it depends first on God's plan prevailing and the people getting into the promised land. And so when you consider that, the highest good, that God's plan must happen, this helps us understand why the warfare and the battles at this time had to happen, because God's plan had to prevail. And they had to get the land God promised. The second thing we need to understand is that the times back then were very different than the times are now. Because you see, they lived in a world where every people group had a different God. There were thousands of gods, and all of them had a people group. And they all argued about whose was the true God. And the only way to know whose was the true God is to know which one of them was the strongest. Because they lived in a world of constant warfare and battle. They were constantly fighting to protect their land and their place, and they depended on their God to keep them safe. And a God who did not fight, a God who did not work on behalf of his people, would have been laughed at. Our God, because of the times, had to show strength. He had to defend his people because they had to know who was the true God in the universe. In the days of the plagues, remember, back in Exodus, there are scholars who believe that God, every plague he picked out was trying to disprove some Egyptian god. So the god of the Nile was disproved when it turned to blood. The god of the sky was disproved when the day went dark. There were all these different gods, and God is proving himself against them. And he's showing strength. Because in that day and time of constant warfare, constant battle, the God who won was the God who fought on behalf of his people, who showed strength. And we can take that today and know that God continues to fight on behalf. of his people. There are other reasons the Bible gives to help us understand these battles. In Genesis 15:16, you can get that on the board. There's an interesting passage. God is speaking to Abraham, all the way back to the time of Abraham, and he tells them what is going to happen in the future. He says, in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, that is the promised land, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Now this is a significant verse because this tells us something about what God is doing. Apparently the Amorites, who would have been one of the people living in the promised land when the Israelites conquered it, had a certain amount of sin. They were not decent people. They were violent people. They were ungodly. And there's a sense in which the Bible is telling us that there was justice in that time. God was waiting for the Amorites' sin to reach the highest point. And when it did, he brought justice on them. There's a sense in which the Amorites were not exactly the innocents that we so imagine. There was justice in that moment. So God had to make sure his plan prevailed and give them the promised land. God had to make sure that they knew that he was strong and he could do whatever was necessary for his people. There's a sense in which we know that justice happened when God judged the Amorites for their sins through these battles and these warfare. And then finally, I told the story of Atticus pointing the gun at the rabid dog. The rabid dog in Israel's history. In my mind, if you want to know what it is that the Israelites struggled with more than anything, it was one particular sin. And do you know what it was? Idolatry. They kept worshiping other gods. Because, well, we told in the book of Judges that they did not kick out all of the enemies in the land. And instead they lived alongside them, and as such, they began to adopt their gods. And this sin of idolatry would continue to plague them through all of their history. And it would upset God. Do you remember the story of Hosea? Remember Hosea married a woman named Gomer who was a prostitute? And Gomer, of course, cheated on him and did all of these things. And it broke his heart. And God said, this is an analogy for what you have done to me. God says, you have cheated on me. You have worshipped other gods. You have given yourself to idolatry. And it breaks my heart. And this sin of idolatry would continue to be the rabid dog, the sin of choice for the Israelites through all of their history. This is what they struggled with the most. And God, in getting rid of some of these other nations, is trying to keep them from idolatry. Remember, when Moses came down from the Ten Commandments, what were they worshiping? Golden calves. It was idolatry from day one. That was the rabid dog in their history that God was trying to get rid of. Here we see all of these reasons why we can understand God as a warrior. Why in this time, in this day, in this age, it had to happen the way it did. And I can't make all of those passages easy. They will be difficult, but I think we have to understand that God's plan had to happen. They had to have the promised land. That they lived in a different time and age when war was unavoidable and God showed his strength through defending his people. We know that there was justice, that the Amorites and other nations were not total innocents. And we know that the rabid dog of idolatry was breathing down the necks of the Israelites, and God had to protect them from that sin. We have these reasons, we have these stories, we have difficult things to talk about. But now we need to take this book, and we need to move it into the modern day in some way. And we can't take it as if it is a justification for our own violence or extremism, because we know in the world that that doesn't work. We know that that is a terrible evil. So we have to realize that our battle is a different one. That we do not fight a worldly battle, but a spiritual one. We fight for the hearts and souls of ourselves and for those we love around us. Our fight is a spiritual one, not one we truly fight in this world. Do you remember Jesus? From day one, they thought he would be a king. The Magi saw the star in the sky and said, "This is the King of the Jews." And they said he would raise up an army and kick out the Romans, that his battle would be a physical one. And when Pilate interviewed him before the death, he said, "Tell me, are you the King of the Jews?" He said, "It is as you say." And when they crucified him on the cross, they put a sign above his head that said, "King of the Jews." They thought he was a warrior king. They thought he was going to battle. They thought he was going to fight. But he fought a spiritual battle. And he was king over a spiritual kingdom. There's a verse, Ephesians 6:12. It says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." That shows us that our battlefield is the hearts and souls of men and women. Our battlefield is in being good people in a world that's not, staying decent in a world that's indecent, loving in a world that hates, forgiving in a world that holds grudges. These are our battlefields. It is not acceptable in the present day anymore to fight physical battles in the name of God, and that is correct. But to fight real battles, ones that matter even more, spiritual battles in the hearts and souls of men, these are the battles we fight, and this is where God becomes a warrior. Remember, of course, the armor of God, the breastplate and the helmet of righteousness, the belt of truth. We fight a battle, but it is a spiritual one. More than that, we have to know that the times have changed because we live in a post-Jesus birth, Jesus life era. Jesus has come and he has changed the rules for all of us. You'll recall Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus talks about the law, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As you have heard that it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If someone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Jesus says to turn the other cheek. He doesn't say to fight back with violence and extremism. He says to love and forgive and show mercy. To give more, to go the extra mile, to love without ceasing. We live with Jesus in a time in which it is different. Our battles are spiritual. They matter. It's different. And I know that this sermon has been technical. I know we're talking about apologetics, defense of the faith. I know that we focused on the violence in the book. But the good thing is that God fights on behalf of his people. That when it truly matters, he can lift up his rifle and protect us from the evil all around us. That God is a warrior when he needs to be, when he must be. Janet referenced this passage earlier, but in Joshua, in the very first part, God is talking to Joshua, who's now succeeding Moses. And he tells him not to be afraid. He tells him 3 times, actually. Be strong and courageous. 3 times in 4 verses. Be strong and courageous. And that tells me that we have the right to come before God with confidence. We have the right to know that God is on our side. We have the joy and the comfort of knowing that God can do what must be done to protect us. We can be strong and courageous because we have a warrior on our side. No fears. God is protecting his people. Eventually the Israelites would conquer the promised land. They would get to where they were going. And one day we will get there as well. We will find the promised land. We won't have to fight for it because we've already fought here on earth. We fought a spiritual battle, and one day we're going to come out ahead. God is fighting for us, and we're ready to serve Him. Father God, help us in our lives to be strong and courageous. Help us to know that you fight on our side. And Lord, I know that sometimes it is hard to read parts of the Bible, and people have criticized these books. But there's a great truth and a great joy in knowing that you are a God who can take care of business when it's necessary, who can protect His people, who will do what needs to be done. You are not a boring God, but you are kind and gentle. And you are a God who can shoot down the rabid dogs in our lives. So protect us, Lord. Keep us pure in you. Protect us from this world, from evil, from sin. Let us know your love and your presence. God, let us not take license from the Bible to be violent or extreme people. For that, I do not believe is your will, Lord. But we have come to understand now, in the ministry of Jesus, and in the changing times, that you are a God of peace. And so, Lord, let us be people of peace. For blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall see God. So, Lord, be glorified in us. Let us be kind and gentle souls. In your name we pray. Amen. This is the time of the